It is a good.
Okay, recording is started. Now we're going to talk about drunkenness on Purim, and I'm going to try to share my screen. I know I've done it before. It can't be so difficult. There we go. I hope I've shared my screen. Shichrus, drunkenness on Purim. Okay, the story all begins in the Gemara, and let's take a look at this very brief. This is not what we're looking for. Let's take a look at the passage in the Gemara in Megillah. It's a very short sugya. Amar Rava. Rava said, Mechayev inish, one is chayev, one is obligated. Lipsume, to perfume himself, one is obligated to perfume himself or herself. We can talk about women later. That means that's a euphemism for getting drunk. One is obligated to get drunk, bepuria, on Purim. Ad lo yada, until you do not know ben oror haman leborach Mordechai, until you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. That's what Rava said in the Gemara. And that's brought in the poskim. It's in the Shulchan Aruch. We'll see what the poskim make out of this in a few minutes. Now the Gemara continues with a story. Here's the story in the Gemara. Rava and Rabbi Zera, two great contemporary rabbis in Babylonia, Rava and Rav Zera. Rava means big. Rav Zera means small. Rabbi big, Rabbi small. I suppose this had to do with their physical stature, with their height, I suppose. I don't know. But these two rabbis, Rava and Zera, the big one and the small one, Avdu Seudas Purim Bahadei Hadadi. They got together and they made their Purim Suda together. Isn't that nice? Two great rabbis having their Purim Suda together in Bavel back in the days of the Gemara. Ipsum, they got perfumed. That is, they got drunk. Kam Rabba stood up, shachte Rav Zera, and slaughtered, cut the throat of Rav Zera. Rava killed Rav Zera in his drunkenness. The next day, Rava was not happy about that. The next day, when he sobered up a little bit, Rava said, my, oh my, what did I do? I killed Rav Zera. That's not right. Boy, Rachame, he prayed for mercy, Achye, and Rav Zera was revived. That's a miracle, okay? The story continues. Lashana, the next year, Amalei, the next year, Rava said to Rav Zera, come, let us make a Purim Suda together again this year. Amalei, Rav Zera said, Lo b'chol shata b'shata mischaresh nisa, can't depend upon being miraculously saved every year. I'm not coming to your Purim Suda. Now, this is very interesting. Gemara. The technical name for this literary structure in the Gemara, the technical name is Maaseh Listor. The story told seems to contradict the halacha, which was just formulated. The halacha says everyone is obligated to get drunk in Purim, and really smashed. I mean, really very drunk. You don't know the difference between this and that. But the story seems to imply that you should not get drunk. There's something bad about it. The story, there's some tension between the story and the halacha. This, of course, raises the question, as bottom line, what did the Gemara intend to tell us? Bottom line, did the Gemara intend to tell us that the halacha is you're supposed to get drunk? Or bottom line, is the Gemara teaching us that the point of the story is the correct point, and you should not get drunk? There's a little sugi in the Gemara can be understood in two diametrically different ways. Either the conclusion is you should get drunk, or the conclusion is you should not get drunk. Well, let's see what the great rabbis over the generations have had to say about this. The Machzor Vitri. Machzor Vitri was a machzor, that is a prayer book for the whole year. When nowadays, when people say machzor, they usually mean for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But back then, machzor was a cycle for the whole year of davening. And this was a machzor which was put together by the Talmidim of Rashi. So we're talking about the early Baalei Tosafot, the early period in the Baalei Tosafot. And since this is a machzor of prayers for the whole year, not only prayers for the whole year, but halachic content for every Yom Tov. It's a very precious source of halacha, quoted frequently by the Acharonim for its halachic content, but a lot of prayers in there too. Let's see the text of a prayer which they recited back in those days as part of Ma'ariv. This is a piyut, a prayer which was inserted into the brachas of Shema Yisrael and Ma'ariv on Purim night. Here is the piyut, here's the poem which they recited in the shuls. Leil shikurim hu zeh halayla, l'smoach b'yayin hatov u'legila. This is the night of drunks, to be rejoicing with good wine and happiness. B'leil zeh yishkru kol yitzurim. On this night, all the creatures will get drunk. L'hizacher chok asher nikba b'Purim, in order to remember what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for us on Purim. Oror ha'ish asher yado yarim. Cursed is he who raises his hand in anger. Lishtot mayim hama'ararim, and drinks the accursed waters. That's Haman. Purim yimale kosot. Purim, let us fill our cups. Kedat ma'lasot, which is the halacha that we're supposed to do. Purim yishtu yayin kol roehu. Let everyone be seen drinking wine. Ad lo yakir ish et reehu, until one does not even recognize one's friends. Once again, Purim yishtu yayin kol roehu. Ad lo yakir ish et reehu. Let everyone be seen drinking wine until no one recognizes his friends. You have to really be very drunk for this. The level of drunkenness which the Machzor Vitri is talking about is extreme. Purim, yayin asher hukam l'smoach b'nei ishim. Purim is the time when we drink wine to be happy. Yavol v'yigal b'nei anashim v'nashim. Let the men, the gentlemen, and the ladies come and rejoice in the drinking of the wine. No difference between men and women as far as wine drinking is concerned. Everyone should be totally, absolutely inebriated to the state that they don't recognize each other anymore. Okay, so the Machzor Vitri, Talmidim of Rashi, the generation of the Talmidim of Rashi, the earliest of the Baalei Tosafot, understand that the Gemara is instructing us not only to get drunk, us, men and women equally, instructing us not only to get drunk, but to get very drunk on Purim. Let's go one step further. The Shar Kavanot. It's not exactly written in the Arizal. We don't actually have any writings of the Arizal. What everyone always calls the writings of the Arizal were really put together by his Talmidim. And this is the Shar Kavanot. It's the ideas of the Arizal, but it was actually written up by his Talmidim. And that's true with all with all the writings of the Arizal. In any event, he says as follows: "La'olam toch haklipa yesh nitzot shel kedusha hameir b'tocha mechayeh ota." The klipa, anything which is bad in the world, anything which is bad in the world, has within it a spark which lights up the bad thing and enables it to exist. Nothing can exist without a spark of kedusha in it, and that's true about bad things as well. And therefore, since bad things, in order to exist, must have a spark of kedusha in them, l'chach, therefore, tzarich lomar boruch haman. Therefore, we must be able to understand, we must be able to conceptualize, we must be able to realize that even in Haman, there was a spark of Kedusha. Otherwise, Haman couldn't exist. Nothing can exist without an element of Kedusha in it. And therefore, we have to be able to acknowledge Baruch Haman. Haman is blessed. Of course, there was a spark of Kedusha in Haman. And by saying Baruch Haman, we are drawing out the spark of Kedusha that existed in Haman, elevating it and making it shine. Below kavanah, but we want to do this without kavanah to strengthen the evil. We have to recognize that there's a spark of Kedusha in the evil, but by recognizing that, we has v'shalom, heaven forbid, do not want to strengthen the evil, and therefore we say it when we are drunk. Shelo lahayil klipa, so as not to strengthen the evil klipa. Well, according to the Arizal, drunkenness is a requirement on Purim. And why is it a requirement? So that we can acknowledge the spark of Kedusha, which exists in Haman, but we'll be drunk when we say it. So the acknowledgement will give no strength, will not enliven the evil, will not increase, not support the evil of Haman. Now, this idea of the Arizal is, of course, one of the fundamental ideas of Purim from the mystical point of view. Now, remember that the Arizal lived in Tzfat, in the Upper Galilee, in the beginning of the 16th century. And one of his neighbors was Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. That's Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was a neighbor and colleague of the Arizal. They lived very close to each other at the same time. And so they quote each other. They quote each other. The Reb Yosef Karo not rarely quotes the opinions of the Arizal, and the Arizal not rarely quotes the opinions of the Beit Yosef, of Reb Yosef Karo. They got along very well with each other. And in the Shulchan Aruch, written by Reb Yosef Karo, and surely there's no more weighty halachic source than that. Chayev inish l'psume bepuria. The Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch just quotes the Gemara word for word. Everyone is obligated to get perfumed, to get drunk on Purim until you don't know the difference between Oror Haman and Baruch Mordechai. So it turns out that the Arizal, representing the mystical Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch, Reb Yosef Karo, representing the nuts and bolts of halacha, are in total agreement on this particular issue. It's easy enough to point out tension and conflicts in other areas between the mystical Torah and halacha. It's easy enough to gather together points of conflict and points of tension, but this is not one of them. Here we have agreement. Now this, of course, raises the question: if there's a halacha that you're supposed to get drunk, which according to Machzor Vitri applies equally to men and women, if that's what you're supposed to do, now we want to learn exactly what the requirements are. As with every halacha, we want to know exactly what it is you're supposed to do. What Rashi says on the Gemara, which instructed us to get drunk, Rashi's words are lihishtaker biyayin, to get drunk on wine. Wine, not whiskey. Well, they didn't have whiskey back in those days. Distilled spirits didn't begin until the 17th century. And this is back in the 11th century, right? They didn't have distilled spirits, but they did have beer. Back in the good old days, in the Middle Ages, when all was right with the world, before modern times ruined everything, back in those days, people more or less refrained from drinking water. There are a number of reasons why people did not drink water back in those days. Primary reason being that it was not very safe. They didn't know why it wasn't safe, but they didn't drink water so much. Back in those days, people drank wine and beer, largely depending upon where you were. If you're in a grape growing area, so people drank wine. If you're in a barley growing area, so people drank beer. But that's what people drank at every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's what people drank. It was safe. It didn't make you sick. It made you drunk, but it didn't make you sick. And if you think about it for a moment, more or less the entire population was walking around fairly tipsy all day long because that's what they were drinking, beer and wine. Now, still to this very day, in heavy wine drinking areas, it's still common in the villages in places like France and Spain. Still quite common in the villages that people drink wine, breakfast, lunch, and dinner at every meal. Even children be sent to school with a little bottle of wine for their lunch. The wine is it? Only wine, not beer. Wine, not beer. Why wine? It's fairly obvious. Why wine? Because the story of Esther, the feast of Achashverosh, emphasizes the importance of wine at the feast of Achashverosh at the beginning of the story. And that's when Vashti got kicked out, and that's the reason that Esther came in. The whole story of Purim got started with a wine drinking party. And since it was wine they were drinking, according to Rashi, that's the way to go in order to fulfill the din, in order to fulfill the halachic obligation of getting drunk on Purim. Wine, not beer. And nowadays that we have distilled spirits, which, as I mentioned before, began mostly in the 17th century, they did have distilled spirits in antiquity. They did have distilled spirits before the 17th century, but they weren't consumed. People didn't drink them. The distillation of alcohol until the 17th century was always for medical purposes. For ordinary drinking or getting drunk, those products began in the 17th century or so. Well, wine, that's how to get drunk. Now, let's go one step further. Up until this point, I've been emphasizing, outlining the opinions according to which drunkenness is the rule of the day on Purim. Now, as you know from my previous shiurim, I always like to look at things from both sides of the coin. Let's now look at the opposing opinions. Let's look at the opinions of those great rabbis who are not happy at all with getting drunk and say, no, 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 you should not get drunk on Purim. Let's look at that view for a moment. Not surprisingly, Rambam is the leader of the poskim who say not to get drunk. As far as the original passage in the Gemara is concerned, up till now, we've been viewing the opinions of the poskim who look at the first statement in the Gemara as the bottom line, definitive one. Everyone's obligated to get drunk. Now, beginning with the Rambam, we're going to look at the opinions of the poskim who think that the story in the Gemara is the bottom line intended to tell us not to get drunk. Rambam says, Ketzad chovat su'uda zo. How does one fulfill the obligation of the su'uda, the festive meal on Purim? And he says, Yochal basar, eat meat, v'yitaken su'uda na'ah, make a nice meal, k'fi shetimtza yado, as well as you can, as much as you can afford. Now, as we've said any number of times in the past, there's no need to dwell on it again. Not everyone experiences simcha through eating meat. So some people, for any number of reasons, don't like to eat meat. They prefer something else. Of course, he doesn't mean that you have to have meat and nothing but meat. He means you have to have whatever makes a good su'uda, a good meal for you, whatever is going to elevate your simcha in the meal. And if that's not going to be meat, so prepare something else for the meal. But
is that understood in that way because meat was what generally people would have to make their meal that way? Or did he outright say that?
Meat eating in different times and places, different societies related to meat in very different ways. If we're talking about peasants in Poland in early modern times, they ate meat maybe once or twice a year, and not necessarily that. In exactly the same Jewish society in Poland, fast forward 200-300 years into the 19th, the early 20th century, and they ate meat every day, and indeed most of them didn't even have milchik utensils because they had no need for it. Here we have a society which went from approximately zero consumption of meat to full-time consumption of meat. There are various historical, economic reasons for why it happened, but it happened. In North Africa, Jews from North Africa in the traditional villages rarely had anything milchik, and most of them were totally unfamiliar with milchik utensils because they had only fleischig meals. Those North African Jews from the villages who came to Israel continued eating their eating habits as they had in North Africa, and it's only the next generation of North African Jews who were born and grew up in Israel, who in the army learned how to eat milchik products. Only they started to eat milchik and needed two sets of utensils. The older generation, I remember so many of them, maybe they had one cup, which they would use for milchik coffee if they wanted sometimes, and they'd wash it out in the bathroom or something like this. But more than one milchik cup, they never needed. Bottom line, what makes a good meal can vary from place to place, from time to time, depending upon what it is you like. In any event, the Rambam also says shota yayin. You have to drink wine. You should drink wine during the meal. Now you'll notice in passing that according to the Rambam, the drinking of wine is not an independent halacha. You're supposed to get drunk on Purim. Rather, according to the Rambam, the drinking of the wine is one of the details of the meal. It's a halacha which belongs to the details of the meal of Purim. One accomplishes nothing, one fulfills nothing according to the Rambam if you get drunk another time during Purim. It's during the meal that you're supposed to drink the wine. Very different than we saw in the Machzor Vitri. Machzor Vitri spoke about getting drunk on Leil Purim, and there's no Sudas Purim on Leil Purim. According to the Machzor Vitri, getting drunk was an independent halacha, having nothing specifically to do with the meal or the timing of the meal. According to the Rambam, it's one of the halachas which belongs to the meal. How much wine should you drink? Ad sheyishtaker, until you get drunk, yeradem b'shechruto, and you fall asleep. Drink enough wine until you get drowsy and go to sleep. That's the Rambam's view. So the Rambam is following his general principle, which he explains in many other places, that drunkenness to the state where you lose clarity of mind is wrong, wrong, wrong. One should never allow oneself to get into a state where you have lost your clarity of mind. Just have a glass of wine. It'll make you drowsy. You'll lie down and go to sleep. And while you're sleeping, so you won't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai, and that's what the Gemara meant when it said, drink wine, a cup of wine, go to sleep, and that's all there is to it. Unlike the Machzor Vitri and the other poskim who spoke about a level of drunkenness which is fairly extreme, the Rambam is talking about just feeling a little bit the effects of wine. For better or worse, the Rambam's opinion rejecting drunkenness, not only on Purim, all year long, he rejects drunkenness. The Rambam's opinion is taken up by the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch. Everyone knows that the Shulchan Aruch consists largely of tension between Reb Yosef Karo, the Machaber, and the notes added subsequently by the Ramah, the Ashkenaz notes added subsequently by the Ramah, where he disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch on every point where the Ashkenaz poskim take a different view. These are the words of the Ramah, the Ashkenaz poskim. Yesh omrim, some people say, which is how he always introduces the principles of the Ashkenaz poskim. Yesh omrim, some people say, in our club, we say like this, the Ashkenaz poskim say, Eino tzarich lishtaker kol kach, you don't get so drunk. Not like the Shulchan Aruch said, until you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman, not that drunk. Ella yishteh yoter melimudo, but you drink a little bit more than you normally would. Back in those days, they had wine, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You drink a little bit more. Yishan, go to sleep. Go to sleep. And once you're asleep, once you're asleep, so you don't know the difference. While you're sleeping, you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. And that's all you should do. Just the ordinary amount of wine that you would normally have, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and any day, a little bit more, and go take a nap. And now the Ramah adds a point which is so fundamental, a point which is so important that it has ramifications throughout the length and breadth of Torah. Echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamid. Doesn't matter whether you drink a lot of wine. It doesn't matter whether you drink a little bit of wine. It doesn't matter a lot, a little, none. It doesn't matter in the slightest what you do. Who doesn't care what you do? Rather, the only thing which is important is bilvachi achaven libo l'shamayim. The only thing which is important is that you have kavana to do whatever it is you choose to do l'shem shamayim. The idea is as follows: and this idea applies throughout the length and breadth of Torah. Wherever there's a machlokas, wherever there's a disagreement between the poskim, and that's on almost every page of the Shulchan Aruch, wherever there's a disagreement among the poskim, it doesn't matter in the slightest which opinion you follow. One opinion is no better or no worse than the other. And in truth, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't care which opinion of the poskim you follow, as long as your choice is motivated l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. If your choice is motivated l'shem shamayim, you've made the right choice, whichever side of the disagreement you choose. On the other hand, if your kavana is some ulterior motive, any ulterior motive, not l'shem shamayim, not for the sake of heaven, whichever side of the machloket you've chosen the wrong side. If you choose one side of the machloket because it'll make life easier and more pleasant for you, you made the wrong decision. If you choose one side of the machloket because people will respect you more, because you follow the stricter opinion, they'll think you're a tzaddik, you've made the wrong decision. Whether you choose the stricter or the more lenient position, if your motivation is l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, you've made the right decision, whichever side of the machlokas you're on. That's a fundamental idea which the Ramah formulates specifically in this text, which does indeed apply throughout the length and breadth of Torah. Let's see how this idea plays out in the later poskim. I have here a quotation from the Siddur of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he was the big name back in the 18th century. Rabbi Yaakov Emden's father was Rav Tzvi Ashkenazi. Rav Tzvi Ashkenazi was the Rav of Amsterdam, and his son was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Two great rabbanim, a father and a son. Let's see what Rabbi Yaakov Emden says in his Siddur regarding Purim. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the son, says, Shamati me'aba mori zal. I heard from my father, the great Rav Tzvi Ashkenazi, Shehu haya noheg b'bachruto l'kayem mitzvah zo k'ma'amara. I heard from my father told me that when he was young, he used to fulfill the mitzvah of drunkenness literally. He got smashed. She'en davar yotzei mepshuto be'inyan ha'maisa, because whatever the Gemara means, the minimum meaning of the Gemara is the simple, plain meaning of the words. And the simple, plain meaning of the words in the Gemara is, you're obligated to get drunk, and that's what he did. That's what my father did when he was a young man. Tzafun bo sod ganuz liyodechein. And there is a mystical secret in getting drunk on Purim, which mystics know about. Well, we already saw the Arizal who explained it to us, so we don't have to go into that now. However, the son says, hachalush, someone who's weak, shemazik lo ashichrus, someone who will be harmed by getting drunk, someone who will be injured by the alcohol. If the alcohol is going to hurt you, harm you, injure you, pshita, it's obvious. She'ena mechuyav b'chach. It's obvious that you're not allowed to, it's obvious you're not obligated to get drunk. The halacha does not obligate you to do something which is going to harm you, injure you, or damage you. And therefore, if drinking alcohol is going to be bad for you, of course, halacha cannot obligate you to do that, and you're simply exempt. This, incidentally, is a principle which applies, again, throughout the length and breadth of Torah. If performance of the mitzvah is going to harm you, if performance of a mitzvah is going to injure you, well, darchei noam, the ways of Torah must be ways of pleasantness. And if fulfilling the mitzvah is going to hurt you, is going to harm you, is going to injure you, then you are exempt from that mitzvah. This is a principle throughout the length and breadth of Torah, b'chol Torah kula. Gam lo hamishtata b'yayin ve'ein bo dat kono. And if you get rip-roaring drunk, you're not going to have clarity of mind, and you're going to lose your awareness of God while you're drunk, and that's not good. Rabba the Shachtel Reb Zera, shining to Rav Guvre, Shahaya Yochel Hachyoto. It's true that Rava killed Rav Zera in the Purim Suda, but that's a different case. That's especially as he was such a great man that he was able to perform a miracle and revive the victim. That was a unique case. Raya Ladava, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli B'dok. There are other examples in the Gemara of that, of the rabbis back in those days who were able to perform miracles. Well, we can't derive conclusions from that, because we today cannot do that. He repeats the refrain of the Ramah. It doesn't matter which approach you take, the approach of getting very drunk or the approach of refraining from drunkenness altogether. It doesn't matter which approach you take, as long as your underlying motivation is l'shem shamayim. Now, one of the proofs he brought was from the story of Rav Yehuda Bar Eli. The story he's referring to, I believe, is the following. He doesn't say exactly what he's talking about, but I think the story he's referring to is a story of that great rabbi in tractate Nedarim. It imna ela kiddusha v'avdasla v'arba kasei de pischa v'chagrani tzidei min pesach adatzeres. He, Rav Yehuda Bar Eli, didn't get along very well with alcohol. If he would drink alcohol, he would have headaches that would last for a long time, migraines lasting for weeks. And therefore, he drank arba kosot, 4 cups of wine only in Leil HaSeder. Aside from that, he drank no alcohol at all during the year. And the 4 cups of wine he drank in Leil HaSeder were enough to make a headache that lasted until Shavuos. Well, between Pesach and Shavuos, we have Purim, and this implies between Shavuos and Pesach we have Purim, and that implies that on Purim he wasn't drinking wine at all. So the position of Rabbi Yaakov Emden is echoing the refrain of the Ramah. It doesn't matter which opinion you follow. Some great rabbis, like Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli, drank no alcohol on Purim. Others got rip-roaring drunk. What's right and what's wrong depends entirely upon your kavanah, your intention. Now, as far as those who do get drunk, we mentioned earlier that according to Rashi, it has to be with wine. We mentioned earlier that according to Rambam, it's part of the Seudah, part of the meal. Let's take a look at the opinion of the Orchos Chaim, one of the great rabbis of France in the High Middle Ages, from Narbonne, from the southern France. You have to get drunk on Purim, this says so in the Gemara. It doesn't mean that you should really get drunk. After all, drunkenness is absolutely prohibited, he says, absolutely, in every situation. There's no sin greater than drunkenness. Drunkenness can lead to promiscuity. Shvichas damim, it can lead to spilling blood, as in the story in the Gemara. Kama averot zulatan, all kinds of sins can flow out of drunkenness. It's absolutely the worst thing possible. However, yishte yoter melimudo ma'at, drink a little bit more than you customarily have every day at breakfast, at lunch, and dinner. Kidei sheyirbe l'smoach, so you have more simcha, l'samech evyonim, so that you can rejoice together with the destitute, yinachem otam, console the destitute, yidaber alibam, speak to them, zoti simcha hashlema, this is the correct simcha of Purim. Normally, you go about your affairs and you don't have much connection with the destitute. You don't talk to them. You don't interact with them. And the truth is, you might not like them very much. They might not be good company, the destitute. To take a slug of scotch or drink a cup of wine, gird your loins and do your best, l'sameach, to help the destitute rejoice as well. Interact with them, invite them to your Suda, talk to them, console them, make them, and enable them to experience simcha as well. According to the Orchos Chaim, drunkenness is an absolute prohibition, but a cup of wine might give you fortitude to engage in interaction with the destitute, interaction which you would normally avoid. That's the opinion of the Orchos Chaim. Let's take a look at the Sfas Emes, the great Hasidic Rebbe of Gur. He was the second great Chassid. The first was a Chidushei Arim. He founded the dynasty of Gur. His grandson, the Sfas Emes, was the second great Rebbe. Let's see what he has to say about defining the drunkenness of Purim. What the Gemara means is, it seems the correct understanding of the Gemara is, the Gemara surely doesn't mean that you have to be so drunk that you don't know the difference between Baruch and Oror. Ella, Kol hayom mechuyav la'asok b'mishta. Rather, you should have a long Purim Suda, lasting the whole day. And during the long Purim Suda, lasting the whole day, you're drinking wine, ad delo yoda adayin chiyuv olav. And how long should the Purim Suda go on? How long should you continue drinking wine until you reach close to the state of drunkenness? When you get close to the state of drunkenness, you know you're done, and it's the end of the Purim Suda, you bench, and that's all there is to it. One gets drunk until, one drinks wine until, but not including, up to, and not including the point of drunkenness. That's the way the Sfas Emes understands the Gemara. Ad delo yada, until, up to, but not including the point of drunkenness. When you reach the borderline of drunkenness, that's when you end the Suda, bench, and that's all there is to it. The Gemara never meant that you should actually reach that level of drunkenness. As long as you are engaged in the Purim Suda and engaged in Simcha, you are fulfilling the obligation, but you should not actually get to the stage of drunkenness. So we've seen the opinions on both sides. This leaves one big issue, namely, what about women? We saw that according to the Machzor Vitri, there's no difference between men and women. Women get rip-roaring drunk just like the men do. That's what we saw in the Machzor Vitri. However, the Gemara in Ksubis is interested, not specifically in Purim, the Gemara in Ksubis is interested in the question of what the husband is obligated to supply the wife. Now, back in those days, the ksuba might have been quite an elaborate affair. The ksuba might have consisted of an agreement that the husband would provide two lipsticks per month for his wife, 3 pairs of stockings. The ksuba might have been quite detailed back in the old days, but exactly what the husband is obligated to supply his wife on a weekly or monthly basis. Rabbi Elazar says, "Ein poskim yainot leisha." When chassan and kala are making their financial agreement about what he is going to supply her with in the marriage, wine is not part of it. You don't specify how much wine he has to supply as part of the ksuba. The reason for this, Rashi says, is a yayin margila l'ta'avat tashmish, because if he gives her wine, the husband gives the wife wine, that's going to increase her desire for conjugal union. That's how Rashi explains the Gemara. The Meiri says, Ein poskin yayin leisha b'chlal mizanateya. Why do we not include a paragraph in the ksuba about how much wine he is obligated to provide his wife? Shaharei lo huzkara ba psika alayin klal. We don't mention wine at all in the ksuba. We don't mention it at all among the obligations of the husband towards the wife. Makom makom. But that's talking about a place and time where women usually do not drink wine. If it's the minhag, if it's the practice of women in whether it's Babylonia or Eretz Israel, back in the days of Rabbi Eliezer, he lived in Eretz Israel, whether in Eretz Israel it was not the practice of women to drink wine, and that's the reason that wine was not included in the ketubah, because women didn't drink it anyway in places where women are not accustomed to drink wine. So, of course, it's not one of the obligations of the husband to supply to the wife during the marriage. But in a place and time where women do drink wine, if you could fantasize such a place, then, of course, he should supply for her whatever is appropriate. But tzimtzum, he should be obligated to supply her with the minimum that is appropriate. She'ein ribui shtiyat yayin yafel nashim. He shouldn't supply a lot of wine for her, minimum that is appropriate. Well, you see, according to these Rishonim, there's something wrong with women drinking wine. And the Shevet HaLevi, Rav Vosner, in Bnei Brak, the great Hasidic posek of Bnei Brak, he was also asked about women on Purim, and his reply was, Ein shum she'ela, nothing to ask about. You ask me about women getting drunk on Purim, there's nothing to ask about. Lo shayach ze be'isha. Women should simply not get drunk. After all, the Gemara taught us, and we just saw 2 lines earlier, the Gemara, wives are not given wine by their husbands. Well, that's because of hiskabrus hayetzer. If the woman drinks wine, her yetzer hara will overpower her. In the Even Ezer, it says that even if she's together with the husband, she still should not drink wine. Ribu yayin, drinking wine for women, is inappropriate, and this is pashut, this is obvious. So we see here some tension between the earlier poskim. An extreme example was in the Machzor, where the women were getting absolutely drunk. You can't get more drunk than the Machzor describes men and women together. And the more recent poskim, who are not happy with that at all. Rav Moshe Sternbuch, who is today one of the heads of the Eda Haredis in Mea Shearim, also takes a strong stance against women getting drunk. Nira Boro, it seems obvious. Even the women are obligated to do all the mitzvahs of Purim, Megillah, Mishloach Manot, Matanot Levinim, all the mitzvahs of Purim apply to women, but not getting drunk. On the contrary, it's prohibited for women to get drunk, lest they come to commit serious sins. V'zeh pashat, it's obvious. Rak ilulei aposkim amina b'zeh tam nachon. I would say the reason for this is when Chazal taught us that we have to get drunk. That was an element of Mesiras Nefesh, and it's pashut. It's obvious that men have to engage in the Mesiras Nefesh of getting drunk on Purim, but nowadays, most men are not doing it either. Nowadays, most men are not getting drunk on Purim. Take a look at Reb Yaakov Emden, which we saw earlier today. And well, if the men largely are not doing it, surely we're not going to impose this on the women. We're left then again with different opinions regarding drunkenness and women specifically. And the same principle applies as Reb Sternbuch says, the same principle of Reb Yaakov Emden applies. It doesn't matter which opinion you follow, the getting drunk or refraining from getting drunk, as long as your motivation is l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, then all is well. Okay, these are my thoughts about drunkenness on Purim. These are the sources. We're going to pause with this at this time. And do you have any questions that you want to ask?
So it would seem, based on what the Sfat Emet is explaining, if one wanted to have an all-day Suda and an all-day experience, of course, hopefully someone wakes up and has tefillah and learns the Torah in the morning, so they can tap into the energy of strong tefillah, then one should just drink slowly and just keep a good pace in order to be part of all today's festivities and not get to that point where then it would be improper to, according to Sfat Emet.
Correct. You've got the Sfat Emes correct. That's exactly what he says, yes.
He seems very balanced.
Yeah, and there's a historical element to this too. The Sfat Emes, the second Ger Rebbe, was very different than his grandfather, the Chidushei HaRim. The Chidushei HaRim was back in the early days, the founding of Hasidus, and the Hasidus was wild, absolutely wild back in those days, which is one of the reasons so many rabbis opposed it. When his grandson took over, he whipped them all into line, and everything became very well ordered. In the earlier generation, by Chidushei HaRim, he was the sort of person, who might daven mincha for Shabbos 2 days later in the morning. The grandson, the second Rebbe, the Sfas Emes, he got them all in line. Davening has to be exactly on time. You're not allowed to violate the zmanim. Everything has to be according to halacha. So this is a part of a general trend. Back in the days of the Chidushei HaRim, the Purim Sudas were wild. Sfas Emes made things orderly. Okay. Nechama, did you want to say something?
No, I think it was very good, very clear. Thank you.
Okay, then we'll pause at this point. I wish you a good week and a good Shabbos. Now it's coming up Rosh Chodesh tonight, good Chodesh, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Until then.
Thank you.
Amen.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.
Amen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you as always, Rabbi.
Okay, if I don't go to sleep, I think I'm going to cope. Oh.